What's up, bros? A question I commonly receive is why is there currently a boom in sports card market? What will happen next, and what should you do with your collection right now? And in this video, we will be addressing all of this. And the first and most fundamental question is, of course, why is there a boom? And in order to understand it, it would be helpful to go through some of the most commonly proposed explanations. First, some people argue that the boom is because we have a generational rookie class. Here, for example, in basketball, there is a Ja, Zion, then Luka, Trey, and so on and so forth. However, those of you who have been in the hobby longer than the past couple of years probably know that this is not a valid explanation, because essentially every other rookie class is generational. But before Trey and Luka, we had Ben Simmons. Before Ben Simmons, we had Andrew Wiggins. Before Andrew Wiggins, we had Derrick Rose, and so on and so forth. And to those of you who just joined the hobby recently, it might sound a little bit weird that I'm calling players like Ben Simmons, Andrew Wiggins, and Derrick Rose generational talents, but this is how they were perceived when they were rooks. And there were nothing close to the booms we experience now when they entered the league. Now, the second proposed explanation is that due to coronavirus lockdowns and government stimulus checks, a lot of people were bored, didn't have anything to do, and started pumping things into sports cards. This is partially true, but this is not the main driver behind the boom. And to understand why, you could observe what was happening in other collectibles. Yes, other popular collectibles such as coins, stamps, they were also experiencing a boom during that time. However, the boom was much smaller than in trading cards, and also it coincided much better with the lockdown and stimulus checks. While the trading cards boom, it actually started somewhat earlier in 2018. So both the magnitude and timeline don't exactly coincide. And this brings us to the true reason behind the boom. And this is that millennials, that is the generation which was born in 1980s and early 1990s, finally has some disposable income to spend on their hobby. So how does this exactly work? To understand it, think about the common pattern of collectors in modern sports cards. So you usually start collecting as a kid, and then when your testosterone levels go up in late teens, you switch to other interests. This doesn't happen to everybody. For example, I never switched to other interests, so that perhaps explains why I'm still a virgin. But for most collectors, it goes like that. And then in late 20s or early 30s, you gradually make the comeback to the hobby. Now, in order to understand what is happening in the sports card market right now, we need to go back to early 90s. And early 90s was the period where most of current millennials started collecting and were collecting as kids. And during that period, what happened is that the previous trading card bubble collapsed. It was a pretty substantial bubble, and a lot of people lost a lot of money in that bubble. However, the people who lost most of the money, they were not millennials, because millennials were kids and they didn't have much of the money to spend. The people who lost a lot of money were mostly boomers and then Generation X, that is, 2 generations before millennials. And because they lost a lot of money, they left the hobby more or less permanently, and this decreased the prices. And then soon after, millennials also quit the hobby, just due to this natural pattern that in your late teens you tend to transfer your attention to other things. And then the prices actually dropped because of the weaker demand, and they dropped particularly hard because historically what has happened in the past, that the next generation would replace the millennials, which left the hobby, and that would be Generation Z, the people who were born in late 90s and early 2000s. But this generation actually didn't get much of interest in sports cars. They were mostly interested in video gaming. Yet there are some individuals in that generation who got into sports cars, but that's a very small fraction of that generation compared to the previous generation. And because only a very small part of that generation got into sports cars, the prices didn't bounce back. Now, the next period where the prices should have bounced back was around 2010. And that would be the period where when millennials were in their late 20s, early 30s, and they would start re-entering the hobby, pushing up the prices. But what happened was the Great Recession, and it hit millennials particularly hard, much harder than other generations, because they were only starting their careers, and if you start your careers during the recessions, you're going to struggle. And so millennials were not able to re-enter the hobby due to the lack of the disposable income. And this pattern of effects, that is, boomers and Generation X are being burned with the early 90s bubble, Generation Z not entering the hobby due to video games, and millennials not being able to re-enter the hobby due to the Great Recession, it created this very prolonged period of low prices in the hobby. What happened around late 2017, early 2018, you can actually see it very well, for example, in Federal Reserve Board, which is the US Central Bank, a graph of generation income. Finally, millennial disposable income went up sharply. And this means that finally millennials re-enter the hobby. This created a very strong demand shock in the hobby, which increased the prices. And this also explains very well why the boom is particularly strong in basketball cards. Because during the most history of the trading card collecting, by far most of the emphasis has been on the baseball card. There only was a short period when Michael Jordan was playing when basketball cards actually dominated baseball cards. Now, this is also the period where millennials were starting collecting. And that's why when they're coming back, they were collecting basketball during this Jordan era, so they want to collect basketball again. The next question is, of course, what's next? What will happen to the prices? And the answer to this question is that the prices will drop sharply from the levels where they are now. But they won't drop to the record low levels which we have observed during most of the 90s, 2000s, and most of 2010s. And in order to understand why it is the case, you need to realize why the current boom happened, and it happened because a lot of people re-entered the hobby. That is, the demand sharply increased. However, in order for the prices to keep increasing, there should be either more people entering the hobby again, or the people who are currently in the hobby should be having more and more disposable income. And both cases are very unlikely because, so boomers and Generation Xers, they won't re-enter the hobby because they already got burned, and actually they understand very well what's going on in the hobby right now, and they understand that the bubble will collapse and they will get burned again, so they're very cautious re-entering the hobby. Now, Generation Z, that is the generation after millennials, they won't re-enter the hobby because modern sports card collecting, it's not the hobby which, like for example, like art collecting, which you might enter as a complete newbie in your 40s or 50s. That's a hobby where you used to collect as a kid and you re-enter later in life. But most of Generation Z has never collected as kids. Video games replaced the card collecting. Some of them, of course, collected as kids, and they might re-enter the hobby at some point, but that's a much smaller amount of people, and their impact on prices will be very much smaller. And then with respect to millennials, of course, their income will grow over time, but the problem is that it will go much smaller than it grows now. Because if you think about your income progression, is that most of your income progression is going to happen in your 20s and early 30s. That, for example, you go to college or you go to trade school, you go to the grad school, and you get your first working experience. These are things which are increasing your salary and your income a lot. However, after that, your income progression is going to be much steadier and much slower. Because it does really matter. Do you have 15 years of working experience or 25? Yeah, it will increase your salary somewhat, but it's not like, for example, you didn't go to the grad school, your salary was 50K, then you went to the grad school, your salary went up to 250K. Then you worked 5 years, your salary went up to 300K. So that's a huge increase in a relatively small number of years. However, after that, your salary progression will stabilize. You won't have that much more money to spend on the hobby. However, the amount of cards in the hobby, it will only be growing every year. So every year, Panini will, or like Topps or Upper Deck, whoever holds the license, will be putting this dozens of sets. And this pretty fixed amount of money will be spread among like higher and higher numbers of sets all the time. So right now, people re-entered the hobby, so everybody collects what's hot right now. So like a couple of players, for example, in basketball, it's Zion, Ja, Luka, Trey, Tatum, Mitchell. No, I think Mitchell is already is not already collected, already dropped from the train. But this will be happening to every new class. So this current generation of stars that will drop out of the train, their prices will go down, and people will be switching to the new rookie class all the time. Yes, on average, prices will stay higher than they were during the past couple of decades, but only slightly higher. The prices will go down a lot because the same amount of money will be spread on higher and higher number of rookie classes players and so on and so forth. And this will be further exacerbated by the fact that now when the first wave of rookies, which these collectors which re-entered the hobby experienced, will fail. A lot of these re-entering collectors, they will suffer losses and they will get burned and leave the hobby. And then because the demand will also get smaller, all these resellers and speculators, they will leave the hobby. Again, pushing prices down and down. Yes, the prices are going to be slightly higher than before because there's just more people in the hobby, but they're going to be much smaller than they are now due to this spiral of the effects. Now the question is, how long will it take for the market to normalize? And this is a couple of rookie classes essentially going bust. In general, it takes 3 to 4 years for the rookie class to go bust. So, like, for example, Ben Simmons, I think he was drafted 2016. So this year, like, he's like officially bust. No, actually, even like last year, you could say that he's already a bust player. So that's kind of the previous generation of player. Once a couple of generational talents will fail like that, then the market will normalize. So that's something 5 to 10 years. We will be back to normal with a slightly higher price than before. The final question is, what should you do with your collection? And here the answer is that all common cards sell, and sell. Because the prices of common cards are at all-time high, and most likely during our lifetime we will not experience such high prices of common cards. So I mean, like, all these base prisms, prism silvers, and so on and so forth. And yes, some of essentially like one of the hyped players might turn out to be a superstar, and you won't be able to repurchase his cards or her cards, if it's like, say, women's soccer, later at lower prices. But it still will be beneficial for you because the vast majority of cards you will be able to repurchase at lower prices, and at the aggregate level it makes a lot of sense to sell now at high prices and then repurchase when the cards are down. At the same time, this boom in the sports card market created the situation where a lot of rare and desirable cards have surfaced. And this is actually a great opportunity to buy these cards for your collection, because this is something which you don't see for sale very often, and if you don't buy now, you might never see these cards again. It's important to clarify that what are truly desirable cards. For example, if the card is just a low-numbered LeBron James card, it doesn't mean that it's a desirable card. Because, for example, I think just recently, I think it's 1920 Select Hybrid Disco Gold number 210 LeBron James sold for $3K. And the same that same card in June sold for $12K. So already prices like are dropping, but this is just the outcome that this Select is not a very desirable product, and especially hybrid is not a desirable specification, and so on and so forth. Just low number and good player does mean that the card is good. The same thing with say 1920 LeBron James Prism Silvers, the first Prism Silver in Lakers uniform. So Lakers just won the cup yesterday, and these cards are selling for lower than they were selling like in June again. So again, this is not something which is very desirable and largely overproduced. So don't buy into the hype. The truly desirable cards are low-numbered rookie cards, really unique patches, important sets like for example say 12-13 Prism Silver or PMGs, especially PMGs greens, and so on and so forth. And these cards also have surfaced much more often than on average historically. And if you are interested in these cards, I actually strongly recommend you to buy them now, because they might not surface in the future again. Importantly, also, don't expect that the price of these cards will go up as much as it has gone up now. And this is because, again, the price of these cards went up because a lot of new money entered the hobby. But as we have discussed, it's not likely that the same amount of money will re-enter the hobby again. At the same time, if you look on this truly generational players, for example, in basketball, would be like LeBron James and Michael Jordan, nothing is likely to happen to them as players. So their prices are not gonna see the bump also from that aspect. Yes, unlike all this Jason Tatum's, Trae Young's, and Ja Morant's, Luka Doncic's, and the players like LeBron James and Michael Jordan, they will always be desirable. And this will allow them to maintain certain price level. But in order for the prices to increase, you really need either for the player to do something new, which is not really possible for these players, or then you need to that a lot of new money enters into the hobby, and this is also not likely. Yes, over time the economy is growing, so people who are already in the hobby will also likely to have more money, and yes, the prices of LeBron and Jordan important cards, such as, for example, 03 or 4 Exquisite, would go up. But they won't jump like they jumped in the past couple of years. It will be more of a steady growth, similar to what you observe as an investor, for example, in S&P 500 or a similar portfolio.